So we have 60 minutes, and we have 4 excellent panelists, 3 of them sitting here with me, and the 4th, hopefully, is online, and I will introduce them in a second. We have Thelma Krug next to me from Brazil, former vice chair of the IPCC, and former researcher of the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research. Thank you, Thelma, for being with us. Excuse me. We have Clara Botto, also from Brazil, co-founder of the SRM Youth Watch and many other things. Thank you, Clara, for being with us. We have Shuchi Talati from the US, founder and executive director of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, or DSG, not to be confused with the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And we have Oliver Morton, senior editor from The Economist, connecting from London. Oliver, you're there. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So what we will do is we'll have 3 rounds of 2 questions, which I will pose the same to each of you, and look forward to getting your perspectives and your feedback on those questions. And maybe after each of the rounds, there might be some exchange between us, and I hope there will be. If you have questions to your panelist partners, please do. But we'll go through the 3 rounds, and then at the end of that, we'll have a question and answer session with the participants here in New York and also those connecting from via the Zoom connection. So please start thinking of your questions, please prepare them, and then we'll get to that in the last 20 minutes. So, but we now, let's focus on the discussion, and I will ask you in your remarks to keep for the 2 questions together about 3 to 4 minutes each. I think that's the kind of timing that will allow us to go through the issues and then maybe some discussion. So the first round, there are 2 questions. First, you may have some reactions to what you heard from Gabriela, from Joel, and myself. So if you have any reactions on that, please share that with us. And then the real question there is, how did you get involved in this issue? What is your interest? What is your concern about both carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification? So if you could share that with us, that would be great. And let's start, Thelma, if that's okay with you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Janos. And also, before I start, let me just congratulate you and the team for this first part of the journey. Well accomplished, safely accomplished. And as you say, this is just the beginning of another phase. So I see this is a big, big, big journey, where part of it was managed by C2G and delivered and accomplished. So thank you very much. Now, coming to your questions, obviously, I really thank for all the interventions. I think that they set the scene for the discussions. Very nice elements that have been put forward. And so I will not react to what has been said, because I think that it really sets the scene in a very nice way. How did I get involved with this? You know, SRM. You know, I have been in the IPCC since 2000. I was in the IPCC for 21 years. So looking at the evolution of the science in all the themes that, you know, related to climate change. So one of these themes that was assessed by the authors was SRM, CDR and many others. So, but that was one of the issues that was, you know, into the reports of the IPCC. But a little bit different, because you see the mandate of the IPCC is mainly focused on response measures to climate change. So we are talking about mitigation, we are talking about adaptation, but then all of a sudden you come in with something that at best is a supplement to deep, deep, deep mitigation. And that it's not really addressing the root cause of the climate change on its own. So to me, it could go as one more issue, one more scientific issue that IPCC raised in the assessments as deserving much more research, a lot of uncertainty in many aspects of related to SRM. But I think that when I was invited to join the advisory group of C2G, it was when I really started to dig into the issue. And digging into the issue was not only from the scientific aspects of looking at the uncertainties, looking at how we are going to move into addressing the risks of SRM. I think Gabriela raised a very important issue that I'm sure we are going to be addressing, throughout this panel, which is the governance of not only of deployment of SRM, which I think needs to be done urgently because of all that is going on in terms of the global north thinking of issues, taking the lead on the discussions, and the global south being somehow left behind, not only in thinking on deployment principles that are inevitable when we think of the governance, but also the governance of research. So I think that if we are talking about fairness, if we are talking about equity, if we are talking about equal opportunities for all, I think that this is really something that needs urgently to be done. So I started to be more engaged into governance issues through C2G. I don't think that I would have been as much interested if I was not stimulated by the concerns that S2G had in terms of awareness of the issue, bringing it transparently to all levels of, especially at the COPs. So I think you're going to be highly missed, Janis. Not only you, but the whole team that contributed so much, not only through you talking to high-level representatives at the COPs and talking to the countries, as you mentioned, those that started with a B, my country included. But you see, I think that the seed was not only planted, we see it already sprouting. So that is the big advantage I see from the beginning of the C2G engagement, into this issue, and now 7 years past where we stand. I'm going to close with that 3-4 minutes, Janos. I am a researcher myself, or was a researcher myself, but I also had some stops in a high-level government, Minister of the Environment, Minister of Science and Technology. And it's interesting because when you are sitting there, those that, take the decisions not necessarily know about everything. Well, rarely they know about everything, right? So they rely a lot on people that surrounds them to give them information that they can rely upon. And I think that this is what we have to construct from now, is to allow all the countries to have informed decisions when it comes, if it comes to have governments on deployment, which I think has to be thought of very carefully. And I think that it needs to be preceded by the governance of research. That is my thinking, so that people are not scared of SRM, but take it as it stands and with, and on good research grounds. So I think that C2G had a big influence on how I got engaged on the governance issues, not only research issues, but on the governance of research and concerns with governance of deployment.
Thank you, Thelma. And I made a mistake when I introduced you. I forgot to mention clearly that you were part of our advisory group. And thank you for being with us all these years.
I learned a lot.
Was so important. So thank you for that.
No, thank you.
And thank you also for underscoring this really important point that decision makers need to have advice. They need to have advice from those who have the evidence.
Yes.
And that's a complicated process, and to build capacity for people to be able to provide such evidence to policymakers, that is really a key issue that we have been following all along. So let's move on. Clara, if you could share with us the same, first, if you have any reactions to the keynote statements and the introductory statement, and then how did you get involved and what's your interest and concern?
Thanks first. I think I'll start by your initial question on how I got engaged. And I think by now many people already know the story, but my SRM journey started 5 years ago in Brazil, where I attended a symposium organized by the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and I believe some of you, or also online, were there. It was, I don't remember exactly the name, but it was a climate symposium on geoengineering. And it wasn't the first time that I was the only young person in the room, so that didn't shock me. I was already used to traveling to different conferences, either representing Brazil or youth as a constituency. And so I was used to that. But what was new for me back then was that we were talking about something I had never heard of before, which was geoengineering as a broader term. And it really frightened me to be the only young person in the room, because all the climate and environmental discussions, they're inherently intergenerational. So why wasn't I the only young person in there? And it was an open event. So I was like, why didn't they try to get more young people here in this room? Or why is the message not getting to young people that we have this symposium about something that directly impacts our future? And so 5 years ago, I understood I would be dealing with that for the rest of my life, because I already knew that climate justice was something that would guide me in everything that I did. And not only climate justice, but systems change. Because in every area of our society nowadays, I don't think it's enough for us to try to change the surface. We really need to look deep down on what has gone wrong and what brought us to this stage. And so that was already how I got into geoengineering discussions on why are we not bringing those who are the most affected by the climate crisis into this discussion, and the ones who will be most affected by those technologies, either in a positive or negative way. And so 5 years ago, I saw the train passing, but I was there waiting at the station, and it was only at the beginning of last year when I heard about the youth program that C2G was starting, that I finally entered the train. I think that's also something that changed a lot in the past years, because even though I was already part of the climate and environmental bubbles, whenever I tried talking about geoengineering to people, they just didn't know what I was talking about. And that still remains in a way nowadays. When I try talking to people about solar radiation modification, they usually think it has to do with solar panels or the energy transition, and then that shows me we're still not there. But people are more open to talk about it, and especially young people. And I think this is because we might be a bit hopeless, that, as you've already mentioned, and Gabrielle as well, we're not on a good path. And so I think that people are seeing SRM as something that might alleviate a lot of suffering in our world, or cause more suffering. So we can't just close our ears and our eyes and pretend that this is not a discussion that's happening. And I feel like, as a young person and coming from the global south as well, I think this is we cannot lose this momentum of really opening the doors and letting more people join the discussion. And I think my reaction from the previous panelists, Gabriella mentioned that we need more research and science within a well-framed debate. And I think it's up to us to decide how to frame this debate. And I think this is an opportunity for us to make sure that all the discussions on governance around SRM will be based on climate and intergenerational justice. Because if not, we might risk having a train crash, and I really don't want to see that happening. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you, and I very much hope that the hopelessness turns into hope, because there are plenty of reasons why one can be hopeless, but there are also plenty of reasons why there are ways to move forward. So let's work on this together. And indeed, your first question was, why not more young people involved? Well, you're there, and maybe through you we can get some more. So let's work on that. Okay, let's move on now. And Oliver, if you're still there, maybe I could go to you now over in London.
Yes, I'm definitely still here.
Perfect.
Janos,
okay,
can you hear
so
me?
yes, we can hear you, and the same two questions. To if you have any reactions to the keynote presentation, and then what brought you involved in this process?
Well, yes, and I want to start by echoing what Thelma and Clara said about my thanks to you personally and to C2G. More generally for everything you've done over the past 6 years. On the keynotes, I was very struck by Joel's emphasis on ethics, which after all is right there in the name of the institution, but we can get, I think, jaded to the fact that this is truly an ethical concern. For me, one of the key reasons why, we'll come to how I got into this in a little bit of time, one of the reasons I remain is because of the ethical value I place on harm reduction. And it seems to me that discussions of geoengineering have to take place within that ethical framework of what could be done, what cannot be done, and what are the reasons for making those distinctions. I also liked Joel's mentioning of patience and persistence. As someone who has a certain amount of the second and not very much of the first, it reminded me of what I value in your organization. It also reminded me of a word that Alistair Campbell, the former press officer for Tony Blair, is trying to get the world to talk about this concept of percivility, which is persevering in a civil manner, just repeatedly, politely making your point. And when I think of the word percivility, I must say, I do actually think of you, Janos. And on Gabriella's points, which I found very powerful, one, it's just so important to remember the fundamentals, one of which is not being on track. Not being on track feels a rather easy way to say that we really are in a great deal of trouble. And the degree to which that conversation does not then lead itself into discussions of geoengineering in any of its forms is, I think, one of the things where my famous lack of patience shows up. So when we hear people, esteemed, established, very admirable people talking about how terrible the situation is, and then saying we must work, and then the only thing they offer for us is adaptation, which is vital and important, and doubling down on mitigation, which will not change the climate appreciably for many decades. I feel that there is still a lack of this element in the conversation. As Gabriella said, there's a lack of research into impacts, and that I think is partly down to the scientific community. There is also a split between the North and the South. But it's interesting that as well as being a journalist and writer, I'm also one of the trustees of an NGO called the Degrees Initiative, which funds research into solar geoengineering in the global South. And we started doing, in 2018, we started funding modeling work in the South to look at impacts. One of the areas that Gabriella pointed out is underserved, and have successfully increased that activity. And I think there's a way in which we fit together very well with our sort of co-evils in C2G, because what you are doing from the top, from trying to arrange discussions of governance at the highest levels, we are trying to do from the bottom, not by directly attempting to talk about governance, but by providing the Global South with some of the means to develop its own expertise, to have its own voices, its own people in the room. So those were my thoughts about the opening. How I actually ended up here is probably slightly peculiar. In the 1990s, I wrote a book about Mars, and part of the discussion of Mars at the time was also the discussion of terraforming Mars, about deliberately changing its environment. And some of the cannier people writing about this, and I think my friend Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer, is definitely one of those, realizing that talking about terraforming Mars was to some extent talking about the climate here on Earth, and on the mixture of the political and the geophysical that such discussions require. There's a wonderful scene in his book Blue Mars, where, not just scene, it's an extended piece of action, in which people are trying to write a constitution that recognizes both the needs of the planet and the needs of the people. And this reminded me of the work by the great and terribly lamented Bruno Latour on the notion of a parliament of things, a place where there was discussion between what science and politics try to keep apart, the inanimate, the natural, and the political, the social. And those ideas applied on a global scale, whether that globe be red or blue and green and white, really started to resonate with me. And so as I went on writing books about planets, I found that I was writing books about the Earth, because the other planets are really quite dull. Mars is lovely, but really it's the Earth that's the, and at some point I came to the need to write a book about geoengineering. And whereas normally when I finish a book, when I finish writing a book, I sort of like regroup, move on. I found that this mattered too much to me, both in that ethical sense I was talking about, but also in that intellectual sense of, how do you do geophysics and politics and international relations and moral discourse all at once and all in one place? I still don't think I know the answer to that, but I think that I've learned quite a lot about how to pose the questions from being around with C2G over the past 6-7 years.
Thank you, Oliver, and definitely the Earth is not dull, especially these days. Thank you also for sharing the degrees aspect of this. Is clearly one of the partners we worked with in different ways during the years, and also this perseverability. It's an interesting one. This was very much our approach. We tried to keep pushing up till the point where we saw that there is no point in pushing further. Like the Security Council, we talked to people and we said, no, that's not worth it. But we kept pushing until there was a positive response, and that's very much how we operated over the years. And just a little incidental. I don't know if you remember this, Oliver, but the first time we met was years ago at a geoengineering meeting in CG in Waterloo, Canada. That was the time when we met. So that was my only exposure to geoengineering before I took on this position. That was a long, long time ago. All right, thank you. Shuchi, can we turn to you now? And the same two questions, reactions to the keynote, and how did you get involved in this?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Janos, for having me. I'm really honored to be able to speak at this event, and C2G has been such an influence on my thinking and my participation in this space. I just kind of wanted to start with a reflection on something that struck me that Gabriela said that I think really embodies kind of how I feel about kind of the SRM and CDR space, and that it's not just about the technologies, but about the world we want to see and about the people that they serve. And I think that just shapes kind of how I got into this field and what I'm trying to pursue now. I first learned about SRM and CDR about 14 years ago in my master's program as an engineer trying to learn about policy. And it stuck with me as a really fascinating space that absolutely no one was talking about. And as I started building kind of my passion for working on climate change and my passion around science policy, these technologies and the potential impact they could have just continued to sit with me. As I pursued my PhD, as I continued to evolve as a scientist, I couldn't get away from the nagging feeling that policy and governance are a core to how science evolves and to building a better institution around research and science. And so, I made my way into the US government, into US civil society. I worked in the US Congress when CDR was just starting to get on the radar of policymakers, and seeing how people learned about it, kind of the immediacy of industry and other private sector actors of coming into the space, but kind of hearing very few voices still in civil society, hearing very few voices across the global south, was deeply concerning. And I think that continues to be true today around CDR. I most recently was working in the Biden administration around how to build a good CDR framework, how to build a just and sustainable CDR framework. And I think that's something that we're struggling with. And I think that's going to have to be really core to how success can be built around emerging technologies. But while I was sitting in the CDR space, I noticed this momentum and the shift that János, you talked about seeing a lot more governments coming to the space, seeing, even just over the past year, numerous UN bodies really starting to deal with these really difficult issues. But as Clara mentioned, still very few voices still across the global south, very few voices from civil society, from this kind of broad area of the public. And I really think there's a narrow window of opportunity to make a change there, to really think about what a shift around people engaging in this space could take. And this notion of inclusion that I think we talk about a lot. I think we hear inclusion, equity, public engagement as words that come up as important, but really not that many discussions on what we need to make them happen. How to actually make inclusion happen for it to be possible, I think takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of time. And I think C2G was a unique organization that was dedicated to that mission, but with its close, I really became very concerned on how we were going to continue to make that push. And that's kind of what led me to launch DSG, and an organization that was really focused on how do we ensure just process, just outcomes, and how do we enable people to actually come to the table, to empower a huge diversity of voices. So the Global South is, as we well know, massively heterogeneous, diverse. We're going to see very different opinions from very different places. But what I see my role as is empowering those voices and helping them find their way to the table, to where these discussions are happening, and to enable us to have the actual inclusive governance that we strive for.
Thank you. And you are, Shuchi, you're the embodiment of what the IPCC calls the co-evolution of science and policy, and that's exactly what's needed, and governance issues. So thank you for that, and thank you also for highlighting an important issue, that inclusion takes time and effort, because people are excluded, and you have to do something to bring them on board. And this is something we tried to the best of our abilities. We set ourselves some objectives to make sure that in our events we bring in voices from the South, also gender equality and those kinds of issues. But it takes an effort, because especially this area is very much dominated by people who look like me. and that needs to change. So thank you. Okay, so we've done the first round, and let's now go to the second round of questions. And there, the two questions that I'd like to pose is, first of all, what are some of the major advancements that you have observed in the governance of carbon removal and solar radiation modification over the past 7 years? And then, what do you see were some of the challenges and opportunities for advancing governance discussions on these issues? So what were the main advancements and the challenges? So Thelma.
Yeah, okay, thanks, János. Okay, so let me differentiate a little bit between CDR and SRM. I think it's important because both are under the big umbrella of geoengineering. And then finally, I think it's nicely split now because of the more maturity that we have with CDR than we have with SRM. So when we think about major advances, when we talk about CDR, and I think that the report of the IPCC on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius was really, really a breaking point on many things. Despite the fact that IPCC used to, talk about CDR, used to talk about SRM in previous reports, in 2018, with the special report on 1.5, I think that it brought the awareness of climate emergency, that many people saw that, we are in a crisis, we need to act very quickly. And more than that, I think that most of the models that have been assessed by the IPCC to limit global warming to 1.5 relied on CDR. They don't do without CDR. So it's completely different. So it's something that is inevitable, let's say, in most of the models that have been assessed. Okay, so that's different from SRM, because SRM is not a mitigation type of thing. So let's leave it a little bit behind. But also the big difference that I see also is the fact that CDR is more domestic. It's more domestic. You're talking about large-scale reforestation, you're talking about biochar application, you are talking about direct air capture and storage, you're talking about something a little bit more sensitive, which is ocean fertilization. But in fact, most of these issues are somehow better known from the scientific point of view. So everybody knows about the implications of large-scale reforestation, and I think we know, more or less at least, the causes of direct, air capture and storage. So we know more about that. So governance, to me, implies more of domestic decisions. So we are going to do this, so biochar, we have concerns, and ducks, we have concerns because where you're going to put it. So, I mean, it's more domestic. SRM is different because SRM might have implications on transboundary implications that CDR might not have. And because of that transboundary implications, you need a governance that goes beyond the domains of your country and so on. And it is much more challenging, Janos, much more challenging. So you asked about the challenges. Challenges to me right now is to sort of make the issue a little bit less sensitive so that people do not shiver when they hear about, you're deliberately, interfering with the amount of radiation that is going to get here. They get scared. Most of the people, I talk a lot about SRM to everybody I meet, basically, because I want to see the reactions in first place, and second, because I want to see how they see this moving, right? Because I think it's already something that is inevitable. It's moving. So how do we catch up? And catching up means, how do I be part of this somehow? Especially for some of the countries, from Brazil, despite the fact that we did have this workshop in Brazil, nothing happened. If you say, is someone, is a research community in Brazil working with SRM? No, there is nobody doing that. And that's complicated, right? Because first, I think that the challenge is to overcome the issue of, let me start first with governance of research. So research is already going on. How do I engage? How does the global south engage? And I'm tired of listening to the global north research say, well, we don't engage because the global south doesn't have the capacity. Okay, number one, okay, so let's take it. We don't have the capacity. So does this mean that I'm going to have to hear about this throughout my lifetime, that I don't know how long it's going to be, but anyway. So we have to break these things. And breaking these things is not something simple, because it means that someone will have to endure with researchers from the global south to let them be capacitated. And international cooperation has a lot to do with this. It's not only putting money, it's not only co-production, but it's really how do you stimulate to have this governance, on research agreed upon and be more inclusive. Now, one issue that I think that we haven't been talking much, Jonas, in terms of governance is that governance must be an adaptive governance. I don't think that we talk about this, but especially for the governments on deployment. So if we start doing governance on deployment now, considering all the uncertainties that we have regarding the risks, countries look at the risks, how I am going to be affected. Mostly they look from the negative point of views and then consider the positive elements into it. So the more we know in research, the more we reduce the uncertainties and the risks, the more I think we would be ready to move into potentially a deployment discussion, which I personally think we are absolutely immature at this stage to carry on. Absolutely immature. So let's concentrate on governance of research, and mature on that aspect, and then be ready to put on the table risks that might be challenging for the rest of the life. Some answers we are not going to be able to provide, but possibly good enough answers to allow countries to be able, not only countries, but I mean stakeholders at large, to take the right decision at the right time.
Thank you. And I have one quick question, if I may, because I fundamentally agree with the way you described the difference between CDR and SRM, SRM particularly being global. But would you, and that CDR is a lot of decision making is at the domestic level, but at the same time there are also governance issues for CDR that require international action, particularly when it seems to me the monitoring, reporting, funding. So would you agree with that?
I agree with that, and I agree that with some issues like ocean fertilization is an issue that not everybody feels comfortable about, because you don't know really the implications of doing that transboundary as well, right? I think it's easier for the other aspects, but I do think that you're right. We do need a lot of money. Everything that comes, Jonas, to scale, right? So you're talking about large scale for everything now, right? So you're talking about large scale SRM, you're talking about large scale CDR, we are talking about negative emissions through CDR, you're talking about lots of things that do deserve a lot of attention. Why? Because despite the fact that they're more domestically related somehow, they do have potential implications, especially if you're talking about the indigenous peoples, the local communities. So you have to have lots of attentions beyond what governments see in terms of benefits of CDR, in terms of removing, especially CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you. Clara,
I
can
think,
we move to you?
Yeah, I think in the past years, governance became a discussion that was accepted. I feel like half a decade ago, SRM discussions, or geoengineering as a broader term, was a topic limited to the research community, or maybe to the climate fiction community. And so governance, not only governance of research, but governance as a broader term, gained attention by the governing bodies that we have, not only national bodies, but also, as we've seen, UNESCO, UNEP, the Human Rights Council. And so I think that the fact that SRM discussions and CDR entered their agendas is already something that there's no way out of it now. But I guess challenges would still be, how can we make those discussions really inclusive and all the adjectives that we've used so far? And how can we create processes that are really deliberative processes? And I think lots of people ask the question, which body do we have nowadays that would be able to regulate SRM? And people always try to put this task inside bodies that we already have, but I think we will need something new. And so that's a great challenge that we have.
Agree.
Would you, just to connect what Thelma said and what you just said, Thelma, you made an important point that we're not ready to talk about the deployment. We need to get ready.
Yes.
So would you also share that view that we're not ready to really decide or talk about deployment issues, but we need to find ways to get there?
I think the fact that we're not ready doesn't prevent us from establishing the conditions to talk about it. Because then we might lose time. Say we're ready in 5-10 years, and then how do we come up with those frameworks in a year to finally talk about it? So I think these are things that evolve together.
Okay. Oliver, can you help us with your thoughts on these issues?
Well, I can give you my thoughts, Janos. Whether they'll help is really up to you. I completely agree with Thelma that, to a degree that I didn't really appreciate at the time, how absolutely crucial SR 1.5 was. The fact that it now showed not just that CDR was necessary in general, but that it was actually a thing with sort of like real numbers, numbers which tended to end in billion attached to it, was really important. And that's led to what I think is probably the most important thing at the moment going on in CDR governance, which is the continuing discussions over Article 6 of the treaty of the agreement, and the question of whether we're going to get a system that really does work for maximizing and making efficient CDR without the sort of like without basically turning this all into CDM Mark II. That's the clean development mechanism for people who were blissfully unaware of the Kyoto discussions. So I think that's a really important thing. I think another thing, which it's slightly hard to say whether it's a great thing for governance, but I think the collapse of trust in the voluntary carbon markets is also an interesting factor. And there are now groups like Frontiers and nonprofits like Carbon 180 and Carbon Gap really beginning to talk about what it is to properly do carbon dioxide removal. And I think that they will be moving more and more into the sort of like policy advocacy space that Shuchi could tell us about a great deal more about than I could. So from that point of view, I agree that there's still a huge amount to be done, but that seems to me more positive really than the situation in SRM. I mean, in SRM we've had thoughtful and also I'm thinking here of the Overshoot Commission report, and less thoughtful calls for moratoria, and I think that's been a useful, interesting thing. But I don't think we've made, since the that UNEA, I don't think we've made a huge amount of progress on actually having those discussions. And although I really sympathize with what Thelma is saying about it being immature at the moment, premature maybe, to have those discussions given the lack of research, I actually push back against that a little bit, because I think there's a sense, because the research is done by natural sciences, not by natural scientists, that SRM research becomes naturalized and solar geoengineering becomes the thing that already in some ways exists, and one has to try and understand the properties of this thing. And I think it's more helpful to think of SRM as an entity to be designed, to be forged, to be created. And then I think governance, building in governance from the beginning, what sort of thing would you I mean, what sort of governability would you want in such a system? So what do you research to find out about governability? Do you think that, for instance, no-fault parametric insurance might be a central part of any sort of like SRM package? Well, you need to start talking about that now. You don't need to do this thing where once we feel that we understand enough, we then go on to governance, because governance may require us to understand things which we didn't trouble to look at when we were all just being natural scientists. And on the challenges front, to move on, I think the big challenge for me in solar radiation management or solar radiation modification is really a point that you mentioned, the terrible loss that we suffered with Steve Rayner, who was on your advisory board, and indeed Salim, who was a colleague of mine on the board of Degrees. Steve Rayner had a very clear, very thought-provoking insight into the problem with the discussions that we've all been involved in, which was that until there's actually someone pushing for something, it's very hard to have these discussions, because well-meaning people, in which I would tend to include myself, try to sort of like build in both the pro and anti aspects of the conversation all at once, because there's no one out there pushing. If there was someone out there pushing, as Steve used to say, it would be much simpler, because we would arrange ourselves on this gradient between the enthusiast and the never on any conditions people, and that would be a place where the debate could organize itself. Without that, and I have to say that making sunsets absolutely don't count in my mind as serious proponents, or well, serious, full stop. Without that debate, we endlessly seem, the people who know about solar geoengineering always feel this burden to discuss its possibilities and its downsides all at once, all together. I think that there is a problem if you keep everything entirely in the hypothetical and think that we have to learn much more before we can really have the governance discussions. Then you will always have that problem, that you'll never clarify things. So I think governance discussions are not premature at the moment, because one of the things they should be talking about is what sort of solar geoengineering might one want to govern, and that would help shape the debate, I think.
Thank you, and I think I didn't know that Steve Rayner actually thought this way about that issue that you just raised, but I raised that point in my own point, that we need now others who will advocate for or against, and that's exactly the kind of thing I had in mind as well. So to just move the debate forward, and maybe in the next round you can react a little bit to Oliver.
Yeah, definitely.
But before that, I'd like to ask Shuchi if you could also address these issues.
Thanks, Anush. So, I mean, to start with CDR, I think one of the points I want to say is that I think CDR has just evolved completely differently than SRM over the last 5 years. I mean, we've seen exponential growth in CDR in terms of interest, awareness, advocacy, and money. I mean, over the last 2 years, we saw billions of dollars for the first time from the U.S. government pour into direct air capture. And I think, even more recently over the last 2 years, we're seeing really massive interest in ocean-based carbon dioxide removal as well, which comes with a different set of governance challenges. But I think the point that I want to make, and a huge problem I see in CDR governance, is that this exponential growth really hasn't been in the governance space. It's largely been in the private sector, in industry, in the innovation and entrepreneurship space, all of which is important, but insufficient. And so when we start thinking about how to build the guardrails, how to build good MRV, all these really important questions that we're grappling with means we need more people who are actually willing to engage in this governance space to build the policies, both domestically and internationally. And I think for CDR, we're seeing a lot of the same challenges that we've seen with other types of climate technology deployment. I think questions around community engagement, questions around both environmental and climate justice, around frontline communities that have really, borne the burden of a lot of injustice from past industry, is something that CTR is very much grappling with right now. And I think there are a lot of good actors in this space that Oliver mentioned, and I worked at Carbon 180 as well around kind of trying to think about these issues. But again, I think we need more. I think we need more people willing to engage with these questions. And I think that it comes to a head for me right now as we start seeing how the private sector is defining a lot of what good CDR is. And I think as we start thinking about, sorry, I got distracted by that too. As we start thinking about who gets to make these definitions, who gets to actually say what good CDR is, who gets to define what actually qualifies as CDR, I think right now the private sector is leading that conversation. And for me personally, I think the public sector has to be the one defining those aspects. And I think how CDR evolves will really be dictated by that question. And I think just given the political volatility we're seeing around the world, how that evolves, I think remains an open question to me. For SRM, I think, it's just completely different, right? I think SRM is just not like any other climate technology we've dealt with. We don't yet know if its use will be more helpful or more harmful. And that in itself is not a question that we have for other types of technologies. And so I want to build off of something that Thelma said around research governance. I think I've seen a lot of pushback around the idea of research governance over the last couple of years. And this notion that, governing research means that you're trying to create overly burdensome frameworks for researchers, or that you're trying to slow down research. And I think that's just not true. I think, you can weaponize some of these things in that way. But I think governance and defining what we mean by research governance is a huge challenge. And, when I talk about research governance, I mean it to be expansive. I think thinking about how we create better research, how we can create more responsible research, inclusive research, how we think about creating better norms and standards for the research enterprise. I think all of this falls under research governance. I think funding research falls under research governance and the guardrails that funders create. And so I think all of these things are challenges that I think SRM is grappling with, but I think so important for us to be able to talk about and could very easily translate to other types of emerging climate research and emerging technologies. And the other point that I think a lot of us have made thus far, I think, is this global north domination of the conversation. I think that's true of research. I think it's true of governance. And the way we start shifting that, I think, is not something we've really figured out yet. And I think will remain a huge challenge over the next several years. I hope DSG can make a small dent in that. But I think bringing more actors to the conversation and having more people actually contributing to what governance of deployment should look like is necessary for us to be able to think about, as Clara mentioned, I agree, I think we're going to need a new kind of body, but what does that look like? And having more people be part of dictating that framework is going to be absolutely necessary, because we can't do that in this room, we can't do that alone. We need a lot of voices who are kind of shaping that work. And to do that, and this I'll stop here, we need a lot more knowledge and capacity building across all sectors, across all spaces and geographies about what these technologies are and kind of what governance really means, how you participate in these spaces, and building that knowledge in ways that are not outcome driven, that are unbiased, in ways that we are actually helping people build their own perspectives without telling them what they should think.
Thank you, Shuchi. And maybe just 2 or 3 points here. One is your interesting point that we need more people in this area, and maybe Clara, in your next round you can address that, or how the youth could be directed toward these kinds of issues, because at the end of the day, if you need more people, that means we need to engage more young people now so that they can then engage later. So that's one question. The other one is thank you for highlighting this, and this has been very much part of our approach as well, that governance is not just about limiting through regulation. Of course, it's part of that, but governance is all those other things. It's about research, it's about funding, it's about engagement of society, of different actors, and all of that is governance. And so if we look at governance that way, that's very different than deciding at now or whenever whether or not we should use, deploy. So anyway, that's something interesting. But let's come now to the last round. We're not running out of time, but we need to move on. And I have two questions there. The first one, which I think we can do quickly because it's been discussed too much, a lot, but what role has C2G played in catalyzing discussions on the governance of CDR and SRM from your perspectives? Maybe one or two key points there. And then what remains to be done in the years ahead? What C2G roles, activities you see that would need a new host somewhere, the kinds of things that we did. So if you have any thoughts on those, Thelma, if we could start with you, but also if you could address the maybe not really different point of view, but a slightly different approach that,
that
Oliver
has
described.
mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Janos. I think that it deserves me clarifying a little bit, talking about thinking that it's premature to have a discussion on the governance of SRM. I think that maybe I was a little bit too harsh on that one. So what is my concern? My concern is that if you push, say, governments to take a decision without having sound scientific findings that gives them some comfort that they are not risking too much. If we don't do that, I fear that they would be put to have hard decisions on things that they do not understand. So they might say, I don't want to hear about this. I'm just 100% against it. And that's it. And this I don't think is the way possibly I would like to see this future evolving. Okay, so how do I see the future evolving? I see, okay, so if we talk from the beginning, what could we do in terms of governance of SRM now? Is establishing some principles. I am already a little bit concerned about when we talk about, as the High Commission report did, we are putting a moratorium on large-scale deployment. Well, what is it that we are talking about? What is large scale? What is a small scale? I want to understand better. And what are the implications of these different scales? So I think there is something that needs to be discussed before that. So when we talk about principles, I think the principles would be something that I would envisage to see for that. And in these principles, I think that we would clarify what we are talking about is small scales. For instance, for the time being, we have very small, experiments done outdoors. Most of the studies that we have been doing, especially on the stratospheric aerosol injection, is through modeling studies. We have very few, experiments like the Great Barrier Reefs in Australia, which is more local. It's not of, global implications, although this is still not well understood, the possible transboundary effects of the marine brightening experiment. So I think that we could do that. We could start with this very light governance issue, addressing principles. What do we mean about short scale, large scale? What do we want to do this? MRV, you mentioned that, measuring, reporting, verification. We want to know very well the risks, but we also want to know and explore the co-benefits. So I don't think that we should have all this vision that all is bad, absolutely bad. But I would see the need for more public engagement as possible ways, to move from now and broadening the discussion to have a much more public engagement than we have had so far. So what has been the role of C2G? In my vision, the main role was to bring the issue on the table, to provide transparency. So you're not advocating. Because if C2G were ever advocating anything, I possibly would not join because of the immaturity. But I think that C2G was mainly saying, I'm not advocating for the deployment, but I am advocating to have something done, thinking about it. And I think that in this respect, C2G has been extraordinary. So if we look back 7 years ago, I don't think that everything that happened ever since is due to C2G, but I do see a very big contribution of C2G to bring the issue on the table. And what remains a lot in my vision, but obviously I am biased because I have my research background. So I am absolutely biased. But I also want to, through the research, be able to tell my government that we haven't talked here, Janos, about the risk risk we have not mentioned even the risk approach. So when we are talking now about the overshoot that seems to be inevitable, but we don't know the level of the magnitude of the overshoot we are going to have to face. We don't know the duration of the overshoot we have to, but science says that the higher the magnitude, the duration, the more we are going to have problems to bring this, to limit, global warming to the levels that the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement, right? So I do see that it seems like inevitable to put on the table the risk stuff. Mm-hmm. And this is not going to be an easy decision, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that it eventually it will lay down on those grounds.
Thank you. Yes, Clara.
I think C2G did a great job in bringing different voices to the discussion. Not only bringing the discussion to governments and intergovernmental bodies, but really bringing people from different spheres of society to talk about it publicly and to have a space to voice their concerns and their suggestions, their fears, and their hopes. Thinking specifically of young people, well, here I am, it brought me to this space as well. And I think a word that stuck in my mind right now is empowerment, not only because I can read it here, ethics empowered, but I think empowerment can be a vague word, especially when we're talking about youth engagement, also meaningful youth engagement, what is meaningful. But thinking of young people, as you asked, young people from different, not only parts of the world, but also different feuds need to feel empowered to be part of this discussion. So I think I divide young people in 3 sectors for this discussion on SRM. First, the already existing climate and environmental youth groups who are still not talking about SRM, or if they have already positioned themselves, it's usually against SRM, but not against bringing relevant and concrete examples on why they're against, but just saying we don't want to be part of this discussion. And I think we need to work with those groups to make them elaborate their points on why are they against these technologies. Are they against SRM or just against talking about it? So I think this is a group we really need to focus in working right now. Then we have young people as a broader group. So we need health students, we need engineers, we need arts students, or not only necessarily students, but young professionals from different areas of knowledge to understand what we're talking about and to see their role in this. And then finally, we already have young researchers that are looking into SRM, but they don't feel empowered to be part of governance discussions because most of them don't even know there is a governance discussion happening. And I can say that from my experience engaging with them, lots of them got into SRM research because an advisor pulled them in or they saw an open vacancy, but they couldn't really understand that there's this is such a big discussion and happening in different parts of the world. And when they do, it's really powerful to see that they take this to different spaces, because not only young people, but us as individuals, we multiply the discussions. And so if young people from different areas, either if they're already engaged in research or not, if they really understand that their voice matters and that they can link this to the areas they feel the most passionate about, then I think we will be making this discussion more open and inclusive. And I guess on next steps, I'm happy to say that I'm working with Shuchi in making youth discussions really broaden and global, and we'll be creating a youth division at the DSG so that we can make the principles of the DSG matter and count with young people as well.
Thank you.
So lots of work to be done.
Thank you, and it's great to hear not just ideas of what needs to be done, but what you're actually going to do. So thank you for that. Oliver, can you share some thoughts on these last questions?
Oh, yes, certainly. I agree with much of what's been said. So what the things that C2G has brought to the table would include actually involvement with UNEP, a generation of diplomats in various different diplomatic services and in various different UN organizations who understand that there are issues that they need to be aware of here. The involvement of young people like Clara, and as we've been talking about before, an encouragement as yet massively underachieved, but still a real encouragement for voices from the global south to be empowered in the discussions. So I think that's a great thing. And Joel mentioned the bittersweetness of this, I think, and I have to say it is bittersweet, but there's something good about having an ending point. There's something good about not having to change direction or to endlessly seek funds to continue doing what you're doing. I like that finitude. I think that it feels right for this. As for the future, what remains to be done, other than saying that I hope that, unlike what Shuchi said, I hope the DSG can make a big dent in these things, not just a little dent. But what remains to be done? Well, you know, frankly, everything. Everything remains to be done. And this makes me think of a very thought-provoking artwork by a British artist called Martin Creed, which is words and mathematical symbols in neon lights. It's currently in the Tate. It's been in other places as well. And it says the whole world plus the work equals the whole world. And you can see that as a certain sort of like nihilism, the sense that your work doesn't matter. That's not, I think, what it's saying, though it is saying that that's a perspective that you should keep in mind. It's saying the whole world doesn't change, but it remains the whole world does change, rather, but it remains the whole world. The whole world plus the work is the new whole world that you've created. And so that, to me, seems to be the message here. We need a more whole world, a whole world that is more whole, and that is the work.
Thank you. Shuchi?
That's really hard to follow, and I totally agree. But I think, you know, for me, and, you know, as over the last, you know, decade and a half, as I was continuing to learn about this space, and as, you know, science policy and governance are, you know, such important issues, there really wasn't a place to talk about governance until C2G came into the picture. And, you know, as an organization that kind of held these issues and provided a platform for them, I think has been transformational. And, you know, again, it's bittersweet to see kind of that platform go away, but I hope there are a lot of new platforms that get built, you know, off the shoulders of what C2G has already kind of put together. And building off of what Clara said too, I think the network and the community that C2G has already started to build, again, I want to stand on the shoulders of the organization, of this kind of huge community that C2G's really put together, and grow a larger one, and start building bridges between all of these different types of organizations, people, geographies, sectors, and really just kind of hopefully capitalize on so much of the work that C2G's put together.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, but we have a few minutes, and if there are any questions here, there's some online, but I'd like to give priority to people here. I see Ligia from Assistant Secretary General from UNEP. Please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Janos. I'm Ligia Nerona from UNEP, and UNEP's been mentioned quite a few times, so I thought I should just come in to also use the term that Oliver used of percivility. I think that's a fantastic way of describing you and Kai, because this is what you've been doing over the last 6 years that we've known you since 2017, when not known you, but known you in this capacity. And it's really interesting that you've been pushing for this for the last 6 years, not pushing for solar radiation management, for the whole governance and the discussions around it. And I think it might be worth just re-emphasizing why UNEP's taken so long to really jump on the board, because it kind of encapsulates a lot of what you've just been saying, and fantastic panel here, so thank you very much for this. One is the whole issue of moral hazard and the whole adaptation and mitigation question. When the 1.5 report came, Thelma, that was the one that really fixed it for us, because you needed to really push the agenda on mitigation and adaptation much, much more severely. And the whole emissions gap report and the pressures in order to reduce the carbon emissions was really key, because at the end of the day, SRM was really a post facto thing. It's the way we've been dealing with pollution most times, but we still had time to address this, and that's why it was very important. I won't go into the details of it. The CDR was much easier, and the more we connect climate with biodiversity, the more we can connect this, and COP28 is really going to focus on this much more, and that's great to hear. But the governance, of course, requires much more deeper thinking. It's there, but you need to focus on it more. The other is the whole distributional justice and intergenerational justice. COVID vaccine tells you all. Excuse me, you might have the technology, but you don't have the heart. And if you don't have the heart, it's not going to work for everybody. And that is what makes us so nervous. That's what makes it so important to really focus on these things before we focus on just pushing the idea of the technology. And the last is the idea of trust and capacity. You've talked a lot of capacity, but inclusion also means trust. And how do we elaborate on that trust going forward? But all in all, I'm going to keep it short. Thank you so much for pushing us all to forcing us to think about this. Let's hope UNEA thinks about this too. And I look forward to the next steps.
Thank you. I know you have to leave, but there is one question online before I come to Mark that actually, no, actually it's not addressing UNEP. No, okay, don't worry, don't worry. Okay, I misread it. So, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, there's not much time to answer this, but I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper to ask you a bit more about the forces against inclusion. We have ideas, obviously, lack of money and resources, and sometimes there's an understanding that the global north, who's looking into geoengineering, is keeping out the global south. But at the same time, Clara, you identify something very interesting. Young people being invited, saying, we don't want to have this conversation. And similarly, I'm thinking about the science. There was an interesting occasion recently where someone in the global south wrote, this is dominated by the global north, and we don't want this experiment in Africa, in the New York Times. 20 scientists working affiliated, for example, with Degrees Initiative, wrote back to say, wait, no, we want to research this, and they weren't given a platform. So I wondered to what extent, in terms of the forces against inclusion, is there also sometimes the feeling that the justice movement, who almost want to see a certain kind of oppression at work here, is in so doing denying the voices of the people in the global south who say we want to do this?
Interesting question.
Everybody?
Anybody would like to address it, or all of you? Thelma?
Yeah, I'm going to be brief. I think that every time you talk about modifying something in the atmosphere, You can talk about the ocean. So ocean, they would be able to cope. But when you're talking about deliberate interference in the atmosphere, that frightens people. So possibly the name is complicated. They have been trying to change the name, right? So not to say solar radiation modification, but solar radiation management, which softens it a little bit. But nonetheless, it frightens people a lot when you say, I'm going to change the radiation. And so I think that number one, it's that one. I'm stopping here so that others can give their own impressions as well.
Shuchi?
Yeah, I think there's two pieces I want to mention. I think first, I think there's a lot of privilege in this space, and I think oftentimes justice can be weaponized. Of people saying, they think that even talking about SRM is unjust, and I would wholeheartedly disagree. I think we've seen a lot of people come to the space and say, I've thought about this, and I don't think we should be messing with SRM. That's a completely valid opinion. I think where I have an issue is where they go one step further to say we shouldn't have this conversation at all. Because if they've had the privilege to engage with this topic, don't other people deserve the same privilege? And that's not to say I have any bias towards what outcome people have, but I think that's where a lot of this weaponization comes into play of, saying where we should land. And that's where I think procedural justice is the most important here of, this notion of fairness in decision making and ensuring that, process is something that we take really seriously, that we actually think about how we build engagement and knowledge in ways that actually, are sustained, that work, that are locally owned. And these are really, really hard things to do. I think, Clara mentioned that we talk about meaningful engagement a lot, but both of those words are not things that we have defined well. And so I think when we think about forces against inclusion, I think it's a lot of vague words and a lot of virtue signaling in this field. And I hope that bringing more actors to it starts to kind of shine a brighter light on those things.
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? If not, we have one question, actually two questions online. One is asking from Yvette Ramos. She's asking whether does any one of us think that a resolution on SRM will be brought to the debate discussions at COP28? Any thoughts on that?
Well, those are personal thoughts, right?
yes, right.
Well, I don't think so.
Yeah, same here.
Not the right place at this time.
Okay. And the other question, which I will answer, is whether as C2G's closing, will you still be represented at the UNEA end of February, March, early March in 2024? And the answer is no, we will not be, because C2G will not exist. So,
You're going to be there. You're going to be there, maybe.
Well, that's another story. That's different.